Senator from Utah.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President.
Senator from Utah.
Madam President, I rise today to take a look back on the evolution of our federal budget over the past few years as we move from deficits and debt not seen since the years surrounding World War II to our current budget predicament, which still involves deficits and debts that are far too high. The federal deficit in fiscal year 2009 was nearly 10% of our economy. This was due partly to efforts to battle the financial crisis and partly to the ineffective and reckless spending measures like as the so-called stimulus. Since then, the deficit has fallen, and from the rhetoric of the administration and its allies here in Congress, you'd think that deficit reduction has been accomplished almost exclusively through spending cuts. Indeed, in an effort to demonstrate his reasonableness in calling for even more tax hikes, President Obama often touts the quote-unquote tough spending cuts that have taken place under his administration. Of course, after spending ballooned in fiscal years 2009 and 2010 to almost a quarter of the size of our entire economy, it eventually had to be curtailed. And with a recovering economy, along with tax hikes engineered by the administration and its allies in Congress, deficits have admittedly come down. Unfortunately, however, as the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office has told us, the deficit reprieve will be short-lived. The CBO tells us clearly that after 2015, the deficit will rise again, and as a consequence, federal debt remains on an unsustainable path. Madam President, as the CBO and every credible budget analyst has made clear, our fiscal path is unsustainable because our entitlements are unsustainable. That means Social Security. That means Medicare and Medicaid. That means the Affordable Care Act. We know that those programs cannot be sustained in their current trajectories, yet the administration and its allies refuse to do anything about it. The Senate Democratic budget left entitlements virtually untouched. The President's budget offers little in the way of structural entitlement reforms necessary to put these programs on sound fiscal footing. In fact, with his latest budget, President Obama has even retreated on reforms that he has offered in the past. But let's look back on how our budget has evolved over the last few years. If you listen to my friends on the other side of the aisle and their supporters, the federal government has significantly scaled back on spending, which they say is responsible for almost all changes in the federal deficit since the outsized deficits in fiscal years 2009 and 2010. We hear from our friends on the other side of the aisle about how they've, quote, slashed, unquote, spending. We hear about, quote, austerity, unquote, as though it is something inherently evil. For example, in June of 2013, the left-wing Center for American Progress said that, quote, we have enacted about $2.5 trillion in deficit reduction, with about 3/4 coming from spending cuts, unquote. In March of this year, Vice President Biden's former aide, Jared Bernstein, wrote in the New York Times that we have generated $2.5 trillion in deficit savings, with 77% coming from spending cuts. And in February of this year, the Senate Budget Committee chairman wrote to her Senate Democratic colleagues that since August 2010, we have had, quote, $3.3 trillion in deficit reduction put in place over the last few years, unquote, with 77% claimed as coming from spending reductions. Now, depending on who you listen to, deficits have been reduced by $2.5 trillion or $3.3 trillion or maybe more. And no matter the number, the claimed reduction stemming from spending cuts usually ends up at around 75% or more. That would mean that deficit reduction has been accomplished by a 3-to-1 or higher ratio of spending cuts to tax hikes. Of course, all those deficit reduction and spending reduction claims represent promises for the future, and they are measured relative to some artificial so-called, quote, budget baseline, unquote, or yardstick, which can pretty much be anything that you want it to be. Pick one yardstick and you get one result. Pick a different yardstick and you get a different result. But, Madam President, it has been recorded that in fiscal year 2009, the federal deficit was more than $1.4 trillion, or almost 10% of GDP at the time. Also on the books is that in fiscal year 2013, our most recently closed fiscal year, the deficit was around $680 billion, or just over 4% of GDP at that time. Therefore, the deficit reduction we have seen between fiscal years 2009 and fiscal year 2013, which is a 4-year period, has been about $735 billion. That's not $2.5 trillion. That's not $3.3 trillion. The larger deficit reduction numbers are derived almost entirely from future promises to reduce spending, promises that we're pretty darn sure are never going to be kept, based upon all the past history of this country and the Democratic Party, by the way. Once again, in terms of real, actual deficit reduction, the number comes in at roughly $735 billion. Now, keep in mind, all the rhetoric about deficit reduction consisting of 3-to-1 spending reductions to tax hikes, well, if that is what we have enacted, you would imagine that those ratios would have been at least somehow reflected in the deficit reduction realized over the past 4 years or so. If not, then let's be clear that they are only promises to reduce spending, promises that the current and future Congresses can undo with the stroke of a pen. And if past experience is the norm, you can count on it. You can count on undoing those promises. I've been in the Senate for, this is my 38th year, and I've heard countless promises to rein in spending in the future, and the fraction of those promises that have ended up being kept is very, 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 very small. Promises notwithstanding, let's go back over the past 4 fiscal years and see what has happened. Like I said, from fiscal year 2009 to fiscal year 2013, the deficit has gone down by $735 billion. No one really disputes this, certainly not my friends on the other side of the aisle, who have used this number as justification for turning their spending engine back to full throttle. Now, given all that they've said about spending cuts having been responsible on a 3-to-1 basis for deficit reduction, the question becomes, is 75% of the deficit reduction we've seen over the last 4 years attributable to spending cuts or austerity? The answer, Madam President, is not even close. The $736 billion of deficit reduction has been accomplished with $670 billion of increased revenues and only $63 of spending deductions, which on a base of around $3.5 trillion of annual spending is a reduction of below 2%. I'll say that again. The $735 billion of deficit reduction from fiscal year 2009 to fiscal year 2013 has been accomplished by and large through higher tax revenue. Specifically, more than 91% of the deficit reduction has stemmed from higher taxes and less than 9% from reductions in spending. Well, Madam President, less than 9% of deficit reduction stemming from spending cuts is a far cry from the 75% or more that my friends on the other side of the aisle claim. Yes, those claims are based on promises of future spending reductions and budget projections. And yes, those claims are based on carefully crafted budget baselines or yardsticks that my friends creatively construct. All of this is future that we all know never come to pass. But if we have enacted budgetary changes aimed at reducing deficits that involve anything near a 3-to-1 ratio of spending cuts to tax increases, then you think it would have at least started to show up over the past 4 fiscal years. As I said, however, it's not even close. Of course, some of the revenue increases have reflected the economy recovering from the recession to its current state, which, by the way, remains sluggish. But the 2013 numbers begin to reflect recent tax hikes engineered by my friends on the other side of the aisle. And moving forward, we can expect even more revenue to be extracted from the economy from the tax hikes, including the higher tax rates that were passed last year in the fiscal cliff deal, along with the myriad of taxes included as part of the Affordable Care Act. We've already seen in fiscal year 2014 through February, federal tax revenues hitting a record high for the first 5 months of the fiscal year relative to a similar period of any past fiscal year. Yet even as the revenue gushes in, my friends on the other side of the aisle want to double down with even more tax hikes. And let's not think for a minute that their demands for higher taxes have anything to do with reining in the deficit or reducing our debts. Instead, the proposals from Democrats are for even more spending, more redistribution, and an even more bigger government. The president's recent budget is exhibit number one. Of course, you won't hear it being called inefficient and wasteful government spending. No, you'll hear about, quote, investments, unquote. You won't hear the term redistribution. No, you'll hear about the wonderfully egalitarian goal of, quote, fairness, unquote, as judged by the norms of Democrats. And you won't hear about big government controlling an outsized and increasing share of economic activity in our country. No, you'll hear about how virtually every private sector company in virtually every sector of the economy acts abusively or out of greed, without regard for others, and in search of tax loopholes to exploit to the detriment of the middle class. Madam President, once again, it is clear from the budget data already in the books over the past 4 fiscal years that the vast majority of deficit reduction, more than 91% of it, has come from increased revenue extracted from the private sector. Less than 9% has come from any kind of spending restraint. Those are facts. Those are numbers on the books. Those data do not depend on CBO projections. They don't depend on picking a baseline, and they don't rely on budget assumptions. What these numbers tell us is that virtually none of the so-called austerity or slash spending that my friends on the other side of the aisle have pretended to endure have occurred in the real world. Madam President, as we continue to hear from my friends on the other side of the aisle about how our budget challenge has faded away and about the trillions and trillions of deficit reductions deficit reduction that has been accomplished through spending cuts, let's keep in mind our recent track record. That record is clear. I'll say it again just to make sure the point isn't lost on anyone. The spending restraint we have seen since the outsized spending sprees in fiscal years 2009 and 2010 has been minor. The vast majority of deficit reduction we've seen to date, more than 91% of it, has resulted from increased revenues. And the past 4 fiscal years have shown no evidence of the ongoing promises of 3-to-1 spending cuts to tax hikes. We do not need to increase taxes yet again. We've already done that. And we do not need to declare deficit and debt victory and turn the speeding spigots back on to maximum flow. Our fiscal challenge remains where it has been for some time now. We have unsustainable growth in our entitlement spending, and we need to discuss and enact structural reforms to our entitlement programs in order to put them and our fiscal position on a more sustainable course. Democrats, of course, have other ideas. For instance, take a look at page 33 of the president's budget. The document discusses the future unsustainable deficits and debt and alludes to a large tax increase that is undefined. Here's what it says, quote, "Even with reforms to Medicare and other entitlements and tough choices, we will need additional revenue to maintain our commitments to seniors," unquote. Like I said, my friends on the other side never tire of asking for more money from our American people. Never tire of it. For example, both the president's budget and the budget proposed by Senate Democrats last year envision revenue increases of over $1 trillion. That apparently is their answer to the entitlement question. Not reforms, not structural changes, but, quote, additional revenues, unquote. If you're going to try to fix our entitlement problems entirely on the revenue side of the ledger, it's going to take far more revenue than what my friends on the other side of the aisle have previously proposed. If that's the route they want to go, they should at least be honest with the American people about where the revenue will come from and who will be paying for it. The American people deserve to know these things. And I think it's about time our friends on the other side explained it to them. But don't count on that. With that, I suggest the absence of a quorum.